no one wants to be embarrassed in terms of how the future unfolds. And one of the embarrassments that Trump doesn't want is to be seen as the guy who came to a deal which then didn't last. You could say that the Afghan failure is his due to the Doha agreement was Trump's agreement. Biden pushed it to the right. He's blamed Biden a number of times, but it was Trump's agreement.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Major General Chip Chapman, a former British military advisor to US Central Command who served for 33 years in the armed forces. He's also a respected commentator on geopolitics and security and is the author of the book Notes from a Small Military. Chip, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good morning, James.
So much to discuss. I mean, just to do a brief summary of what we've seen this week in relation to the war in Ukraine. On Wednesday, Donald Trump announced he'd spoken to Vladimir Putin and agreed to begin peace talks. In response, President Zelensky said he will only accept a peace that Ukraine has been involved in negotiating. And then we've had the various comments of the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ruling out Ukraine joining NATO, then walking back those comments, also saying it was unlikely Ukraine could return to its pre-2014 borders. I suppose, in summary, what are your key takeaways from this remarkable week?
Well, I don't really go for the great man theory of international relations. And generally, in my time in America, we used to talk about two schools of American foreign policy, either Wilsonian liberalism, which is really to do with human rights, democracy, and rules-based international system, or pragmatic realism. The problem with Trump at the moment is a stream of consciousness doesn't actually give you policy. So all the stuff you said in your intro is true, but already on Wednesday to Thursday, we had rowing back from just a Putin-Trump dialogue to now saying Zelensky will be involved. So that's the problem with this sort of social media way that he communicates and with the press in the White House, that you're not having policy development, you're just having this stream of consciousness. So the real takeaway is we really don't know what is happening, but what you can say is that because he has never condemned Putin, and that he's also said today that he trusts Putin, that is something that you would not really expect. Because generally, psychologically, one always asks oneself two questions when you meet someone. Do I trust this person? And can I work with this person? And generally, most people would say that the answer to that with Putin is no. And of course, Putin wants to have a one-on-one with Trump and to negate any influence on Zelensky, because that is part of his theory of victory. It's always worth remembering that he was a KGB officer. That's what they were trained to do, to manipulate people. And again, the fact that we don't know enough because of this stream of consciousness is really to do with what J.D. Vance said today, who is meeting Zelensky today at the Munich Security Conference, that we do care about Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. And he has also said today that US troops on the ground is still an option if Russia fails to negotiate in good faith. Now, the three left, centre, right of arcs that I think I've outlined previously is, firstly, that I do believe that that Trump does take this humanitarian approach. He doesn't think in terms of winning or losing. He thinks in terms of stopping the killing. And I think I've also said before that the problem with that is it rewards the aggressor, because in terms of international law, the outcome which he or Hegseth has said in terms of ceding sovereignty is not something which is a just peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, or United Nations General Assembly resolutions. The middle arc, which I think I've expressed before, is this notion that come to the table, or we'll provide Ukraine with everything at once, or to Ukraine, come to the table, or we'll do a deal. Now, we don't know what's on the table. There are things which they've put on the table which have been incredibly unhelpful. So the two most obvious ones are saying that Ukraine should never join NATO, and that Ukraine will have to cede some sovereign territory. That is incredibly unhelpful to say before you get to any negotiating position. But I don't think it's all terminal in people's in the way that people have been really gloom ridden on this, because the right of arc, which I've expressed before, is what came out of the Helsinki Commission in September last year on America-Russian strategy, is that in time that Trump and Americans will see that Russia cannot be trusted and that they will not negotiate in good faith. Now, if they do negotiate in good faith, then that's great. I think the other two phrases which have been interesting in the last few weeks is that America isn't just going to do things for the sake of doing things. The two key things that they've said in terms of a long-term peace, it seems to me, is that the terms in enduring peace and sustainable peace have been constantly used in the last week or so, both by Kellogg, Vance, and Hesketh. So, that is important for the future, because you don't get a durable and sustained peace unless you go from conflict termination to conflict resolution. The other thing it's worth saying, of course, is that on the 8th of December, as early as that, after the fall of the Assad regime, it was Trump who said we should have an immediate ceasefire and negotiations. I think it will be interesting to see if you can get a ceasefire. Now, the leaked 100-day plan of a couple of weeks ago, which may or may not have been a valid document, suggested that Trump wanted a ceasefire by Easter, 20th of April. Now, Lavrov, for example, has said a ceasefire is a road to nowhere. So if you have a sequencing, which means that you need to have a ceasefire prior to negotiations, then I don't think Russia will go for that, because they see a weakened enemy who potentially their will to fight, and I mean this in societal terms, has been eroded slightly in the last 2 or 3 days by the dialogue initiated in that phone call between Trump and Putin.
Chip, you say that you think there is a fair chance that the Trump administration will come to realise that Putin and the Russians cannot be trusted. But there will be a lot of people who think, well, hang on a minute, Vladimir Putin has been Russian president on and off for 25 years now. There is a stack load of evidence he cannot be trusted. Why do you still need more evidence? If they're not seeing the obvious now, why will they in a few months' time?
That's a great question, because they, in my take of it, of course, is that they have enduring grand strategic objectives, which include regain lost territory and spheres of influence. And that isn't just the oblasts of Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Donetsk and Luhansk alongside Crimea. It is to make sure that the sovereignty of Ukraine is ultimately gone. And that was one of the things, of course, that Putin said at Christmas, that if the West were to stop giving ammo and support to Ukraine, it would fall in a month, and therefore Ukraine is not a sovereign nation. That was what he said at Christmas. So he doesn't take the fact that Ukraine is sovereign. That is why I think there is a chance that they will see that he is not someone who can negotiate in good faith. And of course, we've been warned about this for years, particularly by Kaja Kallas, who's now the EU sort of foreign policy chief, who's often quoted Gromyko in that there's this three-part notion of the way that Russia approaches negotiations. Firstly, you might go to negotiations, but you don't want to negotiate. Secondly, you'll provide ultimatums and threaten. And thirdly, there'll always be useful idiots in the West who will give in to you, and then you'll pocket a third or a half of something you didn't have before. And that's what the danger of what's come out this week in saying that Ukraine will have to cede territory. And that's always been, of course, Putin's minimalist objective, in that Ukraine should admit the territorial realities of what's happening on the ground. The territorial reality, of course, is he's not actually conquered any of those oblasts. So to give them all up would mean that Ukraine is ceding even more territory than that which has been lost on the battlefield.
There are a lot of people who say that if you have a peace that can be spun by Vladimir Putin as a victory for Russia, he will be back and he will go again for Ukraine or some of the Baltic states in a few years' time. and he will use the intervening period to ramp up, as he already is, his military-industrial base. He'll have access to rare earth minerals in occupied Ukraine. He will go again. Do you think that's a threat that the Trump administration simply don't believe? They don't see that as a credible threat? Or is it more that they're so short-term focused, they think, well, that'll be someone else's problem by the time it comes to pass?
Well, I do think they're short-term focused, and most politicians are. They deal in ideas rather than sort of strategy. Strategy is long-term. Russia and Putin see this as a civilizational struggle. I don't think they see themselves as joining the West. They don't mark this in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. They mark this in 5s, 10s, 20s and centuries. What this does mean, though, is it should be a wake-up call for Europe to get its act together. And the only thing that limits that is will. I mean, the GDP collectively of the European countries is far greater than Russia. And it has been the case that we've sort of hung on to the coattails of America in terms of a security umbrella. They have the high-end exotic capabilities. So it's a wake-up call, and it doesn't mean that war is inevitable in a time frame of 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, because again, you can make sure that something doesn't happen by your deterrence policy. And deterrence can either be by denial, having the capabilities to make sure that they can't do something, or by punishment, to make sure you've got the capabilities to ensure that the damage you do to Russia is such that they don't contemplate that in the future. And in a way, that's why the addition of Finland and Sweden to the alliance is a real bonus. Firstly, because there's a sort of Baltic lake in naval terms. And secondly, you can obviously now hold St. Petersburg, for example, to risk in the future in a way that gives you more options than you had in the past.
I mean, Pete Hegseth, there were many people who raised serious concerns about his appointment. And not only about his personal behaviour in the past, but also about his experience and whether he was a credible figure to head up the Defence Department in the US. And for him this week to essentially cede to Russia key demands before negotiations have even begun by saying that Ukraine won't join NATO, he has somewhat rolled that back, and by saying that he thinks it's unlikely they'll be able to return to pre-2014 borders. Is that just incompetence on Pete Hegseth's part?
Well, I think he's still acting as a Fox News commentator rather than someone who's a sort of top defence diplomat. I mean, that's the difference between the two roles in a way. But all the people that are surrounding Trump are Trump loyalists. They will take the line from the top man, and nothing seems to be deviating from that. But again, it's this pinball effect of how many times these people are going to have to row back because of this thing, that the stream of consciousness and is different than trying to do joined up policy. And we don't really have that from the Americans at the moment. I mean, what this all worries me in the real macro sense is this fact that I've always been sort of a proponent really of the Kantian view that the three things that give you perpetual peace are democracy, open trade and engagement with the wider world. America first in its absolute exceptionalism that we seem to be seeing at the moment, and the pronouncements and, again, stream of consciousness stuff on Canada and Greenland and Mexico and, threats of military action there. I mean, that really starts to unravel the international rules-based order. And if you were the main and only hegemon that was going to ensure that was the way we were going to ensure stability in the future, we weaken that. And that gives opportunities potentially for, China in Taiwan and other authoritarian regimes. It might even mean that North Korea thinks it can chance his arm in South Korea. And that's the real macro danger of all this sort of stuff, which we're seeing in the first sort of 3.5 weeks of the new administration.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. I wanted to ask you, Chip, what specifically you think Ukraine's European allies' response should be. The UK government issued a statement a couple of days ago in conjunction with Germany and France and Poland, Italy, Spain, and the European Commission. And I'll just read it. They say we're ready to enhance our support for Ukraine. We commit to its independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's war of aggression. We share the goal of keep supporting Ukraine until a just, comprehensive and lasting peace is reached, a peace that guarantees the interests of Ukraine and our own. They say we're looking forward to discussing the way ahead together with our American allies. Our shared objective should be to put Ukraine in a position of strength. Ukraine and Europe must be a part of any negotiations. Ukraine should be provided with strong security guarantees. A just and lasting peace in Ukraine is a necessary condition for a strong transatlantic security. And we recall that the security of the European continent is our common responsibility. We're therefore working together to strengthen our collective defence capabilities. Now, those are, strikes me, the right words, but what action would you like to see from Europe?
Well, Europe does need to step up. Now, I'm not one of these guys who goes to a magic figure of 5%. I've always said that that's strategically illiterate, but you need to understand what defence capabilities you need within the European part of NATO, either with greater depth of arsenals, so you've got greater sustainability, whether you need more air power, whether you need stronger forces. But I guess one of the key determinants in the next few months will be what is the outcome in Germany of the next election. And if, as we think, that Merz might be the next chancellor, then, certainly loosening of German policy might take place, including long-range missiles, including the Taurus. That will be useful. And we have to go back in Germany's case, for example, to, the Zeitenwende, everything's changed in 2022. Well, it doesn't seem to have under Scholz. And I think that may under a new chancellor. So there is no doubt that Europe needs to get its act together, but it can also use its position of influence with American interlocutors, which we'll see with the Quince meeting at the Munich Security Conference. So all the major European players, France, Germany, UK, will be alongside the US and Italy, and giving this message to the Americans, like you've just said. Now, it gets boring if you're on the other side and you're just, hearing this all the time. But no one wants to be embarrassed in terms of how the future unfolds. And one of the embarrassments that Trump doesn't want is to be seen as the guy who came to a deal which then didn't last. You could say that the Afghan failure is his due to the Doha agreement was Trump's agreement. Biden pushed it to the right. He's blamed Biden a number of times, but it was Trump's agreement. So you need to have this robust, enduring agreement for the future if there is an agreement. And I'm not sure there will be in terms of the acceleration as well. I think people can get carried away in timeframes. And often of this, of course, I'm quoting historical examples. But for example, it took 500 rounds of negotiations and 2 years to get to a settlement in the Korean War. And it took 5 years to get to a settlement in the Vietnam War with the Paris Peace Accords. So to suggest that we're going to have this wrapped up in 100 days seems to me at the moment to be incredibly optimistic when wars normally stop, as I've said before, either because of decisive military victory, that is not going to happen at the moment, or because of the improbability of military victory, that is more likely. No one is going to win at the operational strategic level at the moment, or because of unacceptable costs. Those costs are high at the moment, both in terms of numbers of killed, damage to the Ukrainian infrastructure, damage to the oil refining infrastructure of Russia. But there are also imperatives which mean that wars don't stop. And some of those, of course, are needs for sufficient victory, either on the Russian side or the Ukrainian side, to justify this cost or sacrifice which has already been incurred. And the cost incurred is not something at the moment that Zelensky is going to sign up to for the loss of a massive amount of territory, if that is what is on the table, with no security guarantee. Now, I think Zelensky could go for a position where he doesn't have a entry to NATO. I think he'd like a roadmap for an entry to NATO. But what he absolutely needs is some sort of security guarantee. Now, again, the Russian view would be that Ukraine should probably be a neutral nation forevermore. And generally, the neutral nation that he wants is a nation which has caveated armed forces numerically and doesn't have a security guarantee. That would be an absolute disaster for Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, of course, could do bilateral defence agreements with a number of European countries to ensure that some came to their aid. But again, the notion that that Putin would allow in any agreement, signed agreement, European troops to be stationed in Ukraine seems to me to be chimerical, because one of the things that he always says he went to war for was to stop the eastward expansion of NATO. No, I think that's a myth. It's just one of the justifications for war. But he's just not going to allow that. So maybe that will also be one of the things that the Trump administration will see, that he won't negotiate in good faith.
And what security guarantee will be acceptable to Zelensky? Because, we mention it almost every week on Frontline. The Budapest Memorandum lives large in the imagination of the Ukrainian people. They remember how essentially they were sold out by Britain and America back in 1994, and how when just 20 years later they faced the Russian aggression that it was designed to prevent, Britain and America did not sufficiently come to their aid. So why should Zelensky accept any such security guarantee now?
Well, that's right. And he certainly doesn't think that that would be an acceptable security guarantee from the Europeans, unless we go back to our previous points that the Europeans significantly increase their defence capability and are capable of war fighting between the operational and strategic level by themselves, because it's exotic C3 and intelligence, for example, of the Americans, and their air power, which really brings the sort of game changers to bear. Of course, it's wider than the Budapest Memorandum, because this is where Guterres always comes in a way, in terms of what is a just war and a just peace. Because under the UN Charter, Article 2 brackets 4 close brackets, war is essentially outlawed in the UN Charter unless two things pertain: unless it is underpinned by a UN Security Council resolution, which has always been the justification, for example, for some of the Gulf Wars and the intervention in Afghanistan, or in self-defense under Article 51. None of those pertained in the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And that's why it's extraordinary that Trump has never condemned Putin in the way that some of the language of Biden was extremely strong, very rhetorical, but justified in terms of what has transpired in the last, not just 3 years, because of course one would have to really go back to, the Russians invaded Georgia in 2008. And this all goes back to everything I keep saying about Russians' grand strategic objective is to regain territory, lost spheres of influence, and not allow those countries who were in their Soviet Union orbit to go to the West if they can help it, or to ensure that in the future they come back into their orbit. And again, the Munich Security Conference in 2007 was when Putin said that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. He wants to correct that.
And they say the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and hoping for different results. And it seems like we don't learn our lesson, that we didn't sufficiently stand up to Putin over Georgia in 2008. We didn't sufficiently stand up to him over Crimea in 2014. And it sounds like the US is prepared to sell out Ukraine despite the full-scale invasion of 2022. I just wonder, Chip, if Zelensky refuses to sign up to any peace agreement that Donald Trump tries to broker with Vladimir Putin, is there any way in which Ukraine can continue its war effort with increased support from Europe?
Yeah, I think they can. Now, again, they will lose some of the exotica of the American armory. Again, it's the intelligence, it's the HIMARS, it's all those things. But if Germany came on side, some of that could be sort of minimised a bit. But, we don't want to kid ourselves. The Americans are, in terms of defence spending and capabilities, are far outgrade any other country in the world. The only thing that Trump also sort of overplays, of course, is, for example, his figure at the moment of 500 billion in terms of American support. I mean, in terms of support across the spectrum of humanitarian, economic, military, it's about equivalent from the European and wider countries and America at about 160 billion. Now, the delivery of some of that is still, ongoing from both sets of those interlocutors. So it doesn't have to be disastrous for Ukraine, particularly if they fight a good, deep battle. But one of the things, of course, which is a structural and organizational problem, is mobilization for Ukraine and in the future for Russia. And you need infantry to hold ground, and that is a weakness at the moment for Ukraine. Now, again, some of those bilaterals may come into play. So, for example, Poland has always seen the threat from Russia as existential. If Russia were winning in terms of suddenly there's a collapse of a big portion of the front and Russia were exploiting that, don't think they have the operational maneuver to be able to do that currently, then Poland could technically send troops to aid Russia. So there's still a lot of scenarios out there which don't mean that this has to be completely doom laden for the future.
And just finally, Chip, you mentioned the mobilisation issues for Ukraine. Is this now the point where if Zelensky is serious about continuing the fight against Russia, he is going to have to lower the conscription age?
Well, I think, of course, at some stage you're going to have to do that. And I think, it's admirable that you're trying to preserve the lives of your youngest, because I think the age of conscription at the moment is 25. And generally in European history, it's been the youngsters sort of 18, 19, 20 are the ones who die in conflict. So I think in terms of preserving your future generation, that is admirable. But in the military, we always have a thing in our mission analysis under question 4, and that is, has the situation changed? And the answer to that is yes, it has. And if the answer to that is yes, then sometimes you've got to change your policy and adapt quickly.
Chip, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
You're welcome, James.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us